A lot of people can't wait for vaccination passports. Others think the concept is outrageous. This video discusses the legality of vaccination passports. Hello, I'm Barrister Daniel Barnett. Many organisations, from governments around the world to airlines, theatres, pubs, restaurants and cinemas, are thinking about introducing vaccine passports. Vaccine passports would prohibit entry to people who can't prove they've been vaccinated or can't prove they have some other form of immunity from COVID-19. Although there remains uncertainty about the extent, the growing consensus of medical opinion is that the vaccine impedes transmissibility of the virus. As an example, a study by the University of Oxford has reported that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine may have a substantial effect on transmission. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that the vaccine passports raise
deep and complex issues that we need to explore, ethical issues.
He has announced a review about the feasibility and the ethics of introducing vaccine passports, which is being led by Michael Gove, and it hopes to report by mid-June. Now, it's important to remember there's a difference between bringing in vaccine passports for things in the UK, which is covered by laws which Parliament can set, and vaccine passports for international travel, where we're going to be very much at the mercy of other countries setting their own policies about who they will let in, and international airlines setting policies on who they will allow onto their aeroplanes. Nobody really knows yet what a coronavirus passport will look like. At the moment, if you're vaccinated, you're given a card as proof and asked not to post copies of it anywhere on social media so as to limit the chance for fraud. But any eventual vaccination passport is likely to take the form not of a piece of paper, but of a digital document which allows you to prove your health status, i.e. the results of antigen and antibody tests, or prove your digital vaccination records. It's most likely to take the form of an app on your phone, but possibly it could be a QR code or some other form of wearable item, such as an electronic fob or bracelet. If the passport's stored locally on your phone or on a piece of wearable equipment, it means there's less of a need for a central database containing your health data, which in turn reduces the privacy and data protection implications. I'm just going to explain the main arguments in favour of and against vaccination passports before I come to the legalities. For now, I'm not expressing a view on which is the better argument. The arguments in favour of vaccination passports are that they allow a swift return to normal life without compromising on public health interests. They allow organisations to open, perhaps without rigorous adherence to social distancing, and allow gatherings in larger groups to take place without causing another lockdown, another peak, and risking the NHS. The obvious people to release first from lockdown are those who are immune. It's not just about going to the pub, runs the argument, it's about people feeling confident to get medical care for other reasons, for mental health, to enable safer care of the vulnerable, and to get society moving again. It's also said that vaccination passports are temporary. Once herd immunity is reached, we won't need them anymore. The arguments against vaccination passports are both theoretical and practical. The practical arguments are that vaccination does not prevent transmissibility, so you can still infect others even if you're unlikely to fall seriously ill yourself. The theoretical argument against introduction of the vaccine is that it amounts to indirect vaccine compulsion and creates a second-class citizenry. Although no one will compel you to have the vaccine, if you don't, you can't enjoy the same rights and freedoms that the person living next door to you has. And there are real issues about whether there's any point to vaccination certificates. Here's Robert Dingwall, Professor of Sociology at Nottingham Trent University.
The only working model of an immunity certificate is in the Californian porn industry. And there it matters because information about another person's HIV status is necessary to protect you. Information about another person's COVID status is not necessary to protect you once you've been vaccinated, because we have a vaccine for COVID and we don't have a vaccine for HIV.
I found this quite interesting. At the time I recorded this video, the very end of February 2021, just over 2,000 people have signed a petition to introduce vaccine passports, whereas over 200,000 have signed a petition not to. That's 100 times as many. What that reflects, of course, is the relative anxiety levels of those who are concerned about vaccine passports, but it's telling nevertheless. There's also the overseas travel issue. Vaccination passports mean that countries without the high vaccination levels that we have in the UK will be more willing to open their borders to UK travellers. Now, this is nothing new. Here's Dr. Edgar Whitley from the London School of Economics.
That's not that dissimilar to yellow fever vaccination certificates, etc., which historically have been paper-based things, typically checked once at immigration control. You show your passport, you show any visas, and if required, you also show that you've been vaccinated, historically for yellow fever, but nowadays also potentially for coronavirus.
The CEO of Australian airline Qantas recently said that he viewed proof of immunity from COVID-19 as a necessity for international travel. Likewise, Saga, which specialises in holidays for the over 50s, has said passengers on its 2021 holidays or cruises must be fully vaccinated. This also seems to be the view of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who said in February 2021 that
international side of things, international travel, there will be insisting on vaccine passport.
The International Air Transport Association and the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization have also said they back the idea of vaccination passports. However, the World Travel and Tourism Council has said that a strategy for restarting international travel should be based on testing rather than a vaccine-centred scheme. At one extreme, Parliament could pass new primary legislation creating two types of citizens' rights. One for people who can demonstrate immunity and one for those who can't. I think that's unlikely, at least for the moment, and I'll talk more about that at the end of this video. I'm going to focus for now on what the law currently is, rather than speculate on what Parliament might change it to at some unspecified point in the future. So let's look at the current laws on discrimination and see whether they provide any protection for people who don't want to be treated differently because they've refused to have the coronavirus vaccine. The basic argument is that vaccine passports discriminate against those who haven't had a vaccination or can't establish immunity because they ban those people from access to services. The Equality Act 2010 sets out the legal rules banning particular types of discrimination. It offers comprehensive protection against discrimination on the grounds of age, disability, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, and pregnancy and maternity. It applies both in the context of the workplace and also to those offering goods and services, which includes pubs, cinemas, and restaurants. Now, it's immediately clear from the list I've just given you that immunity from coronavirus is not a protected characteristic, so it doesn't fall directly under the Equality Act. But there's a form of discrimination called indirect discrimination, which is also banned by the Equality Act, and that occurs when, number one, a business provider or a service provider denies access to someone because of a rule they've brought in, such as a customer having to have a vaccination passport. Number two, that the rule impacts disproportionately on people with a protected characteristic, such as age or pregnancy or race. And number three, that there's no good business reason to justify the otherwise discriminatory rule. Now, there are some groups which are particularly affected by a rule that someone has to have a vaccine to enter a pub or a restaurant or a cinema. For a short while, medical opinion advised against pregnant women having the vaccination, although that's now changed, and as at the date of recording this video in late February 2021, my understanding of medical opinion, I'm not a doctor, my understanding of medical opinion is that pregnant women will normally be advised to have the vaccine. But possibly because of the change of position, or simply because of understandable caution, many pregnant women may postpone the vaccination. And if so, then a requirement to show a vaccination passport impacts disproportionately against pregnant women. A much lower percentage of pregnant women will be able to get a coronavirus vaccination passport than non-pregnant women because of vaccine hesitancy. Likewise, until the vaccine is rolled out to the whole population, younger people are going to be less likely to get the vaccine because it's the older generation that's getting the vaccine at the moment. So unless they, younger people, can demonstrate immunity through a positive antibody test, a requirement for a vaccine certificate discriminates indirectly against younger people because of their age. So we have pregnancy, we have age. Third, some people may have a disability. Disability is a protected characteristic, which means they shouldn't have the vaccine. Now, the American Centre for Disease Control, at the time of recording this video, is advising that those with autoimmune conditions can have the vaccine. I understand the NHS is giving the same advice, but inevitably some medical professionals may take a different view, and further studies may yield different data. Fourth, and finally, there's also the point, which is only beginning to emerge at the time I'm recording this video, that there is a much lower take-up of the vaccine within the BAME community, and that for a variety of possible reasons, people of colour are less likely to be vaccinated and hence less likely to be in possession of a coronavirus passport than white individuals. Now, I know more evidence will emerge on this, but it does seem that there's a credible argument that a requirement to have a vaccination passport indirectly discriminates against minority ethnic and racial groups. So all in all, that's 3 groups who can claim indirect discrimination: pregnant women, younger people, and members of the BAME community, and those with specific disabilities who may also be able to, although that's less clear. Some also argue that those with strong anti-vaccination beliefs should qualify for protection under the protected characteristic of religion and belief. But for reasons I'm not going to go into on this video, I don't agree with that. So let's assume a person of colour tries to go into a restaurant, is refused because he doesn't have a COVID passport, and wants to bring an indirect racial discrimination claim. He ticks the first 2 boxes. Can the restaurant argue that its insistence on a vaccination passport is justified, because that would be a defence to a claim? I don't think so. It's not clear, but I don't think so. I think the restaurant or the cinema or the pub would struggle to establish justification. There are 2 limbs to a justification defence. The first is that the restaurant or the pub or the cinema has a legitimate aim which it's pursuing. I think that bit's obvious. Of course it does. It's trying to impede transmission of the COVID virus amongst its staff and its clients, and act in a socially responsible way to help prevent excessive illness and overwhelm the NHS. But it's with the second bit that I think the restaurant or the pub or the cinema will struggle. The second bit of the justification defence is that the method of achieving that aim, i.e. show a vaccination passport or you can't come in, has to be proportionate. In other words, that there's no better way of achieving the aim, reducing COVID, without discriminating against pregnant women, against younger people, or against people of colour. And I don't think a vaccination passport meets that test for 2 reasons. First, it's clear that having had the virus, or having had the vaccine, doesn't stop you passing it on to others. Yes, it reduces transmissibility, but it doesn't prevent it, particularly with the passage of time. So although impeding transmission is a legitimate aim, it's not clear that a vaccination passport is a particularly effective way of achieving that aim, which feeds into the overall question of proportionality. I said 2 reasons. Second, there are other ways of testing that someone isn't infectious, primarily using rapid antigen tests at the point of entry. They're not ideal, they don't have a 100% accuracy rate, but neither does vaccination have a 100% success rate. They're cheap. If you buy in bulk, you can get them for less than £1. They're plainly safe for pregnant women, and they don't have the impact on younger people, on BAME individuals, or on those with certain disabilities that a requirement for a vaccination might have. Now, on the face of it, this point only helps those in the affected groups, but it goes wider, because what a restaurant can't say is, we won't make you show a vaccination passport if you're a person of colour, or disabled, or pregnant, or young, but we will make you show a passport if you're not in those categories, if you're a middle-aged white bloke, because that's discrimination against middle-aged white blokes on grounds of age, on grounds of race, on grounds of sex. So although the issue of justification is more nuanced than I've been able to describe in this summary, and although it's going to need a court to make the final decision, I think that a requirement by restaurants, by pubs, by cinemas, etc., to show a coronavirus passport at the point of entry is just about on the wrong side of the proportionality tipping point and will be regarded as discriminatory and therefore unlawful by the courts. Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights requires that the state, that includes the UK, respect someone's private life. In the UK, we have the Human Rights Act 1998, which requires courts to factor in this right when interpreting the law. The concept of private life includes the protection of personal information concerning one's health, such as biometric data. But nobody has an absolute right to privacy. Public authorities can justify interference with this right under specific conditions, including the economic well-being of the country or the protection of health. Any interference with the concept of a private life requires that interference to be necessary. In the context of vaccination passports, that box, necessary, is likely to be ticked because of the urgent need to address the unprecedented economic consequences of the pandemic and the unprecedented health consequences, which includes the mental health consequences of not being released from lockdown. However, the interference with the concept of a private life also requires the interference to be proportionate. And here, those arguing that vaccination passports are lawful are going to face similar difficulties. They're not insurmountable, but they're difficulties to those trying to justify discrimination, which I spoke about earlier. It's slightly different and in fact easier for a state to justify interference in private life because of something called a margin of appreciation, which means states are given quite a wide discretion to decide where they're going to place the balance between public interest and private rights. In the context of international travel, I don't think anyone's ever suggested that requiring evidence of yellow fever, vaccination or polio inoculation before you can enter a country is contrary to human rights. Overall, I suspect human rights will not be the issue that determines vaccine passports. It's far more likely to be discrimination or possibly even data protection law and the difficulties complying with data protection requirements. The Data Protection Act 2018 brings the European General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, into force in the UK, and it remains in force post-Brexit. Health data such as vaccination records or the results of your COVID-19 antibody tests have a special reinforced level of protection under Article 9 of the GDPR. It requires our laws to provide adequate measures to safeguard the rights of individuals, even when the state, the UK, is pursuing public health interests. The limitation is that this doesn't really prevent storage or use of such data, given the context of the pandemic. What it does do is require the UK to make sure that the data is properly stored and not misused by any public or private sector providers to whom, for example, app contracts might be given. It also includes requirements for whomever stores such data to do so fairly, accurately, and confidentially. Any breaches mean that the organisation responsible for a breach can be fined up to 20 million euros, or 4% of their annual turnover if greater, by the Information Commissioner's Office, and could also be sued by any affected individuals. But of course, this doesn't make vaccination passports unlawful per se. It just makes it unlawful for the government, or whomever the government tenders the responsibility for running the app out to. It makes it unlawful for them to do a rubbish job with vaccination passports or not follow data protection rules. Is there any way of attacking vaccination passports on the basis they impede freedom of movement? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. The right to freedom of movement. The problem is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights isn't a legal treaty and it's not legally binding. It's also subject to all sorts of exceptions, because if you took that statement literally, everyone has the right to freedom of movement, putting people in prison would be against international law, as it's restricting their freedom of movement. Plainly, that's not the case. Freedom of assembly, which is similar, is protected under the European Convention of Human Rights. It's Article 11 in particular that covers it. Again, that's not directly enforceable, but it does have to be taken into account when the courts decide what the law actually is, when interpreting the law. Article 11 states that everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, but that right can be restricted under a number of exceptions, one of which is the protection of health. So no joy there. So what's the answer? Well, as the law stands, I think the introduction of vaccination passports to preclude access to pubs, restaurants, cinemas, concerts, gyms, I think it's likely to be indirectly discriminatory against certain groups and as a result unlawful, although there are plenty of credible arguments and opinions that go the other way. The cold, hard reality, though, is that if we start getting service providers precluding access to those without vaccination passports, there's nothing in practice you can do about it apart from issue a claim in the county court, wait months or years for the claim to reach a conclusion, and get a very small money judgment. Very small. It's not going to help you go for a beer in the pub tonight. There's also issues around whether a vaccine passport solves very much. Here's Sir Jonathan Montgomery, Professor of Healthcare Law at University College London.
It's not clear what problem passports would solve. So if we're trying to reopen the economy and get people travelling, they won't be available until the very end of 2021 because not enough people will be vaccinated. So it seems a red herring to look at passports when the key question is how to make venues safe, how to make travel safe.
What's also not clear is what the future holds. There is absolutely no doubt that even if I'm right and vaccination passports are unlawful, there's no doubt that Parliament can introduce new legislation which takes vaccination passports outside the scope of the Equality Act. Now, I think that's unlikely, and it's even more unlikely that would happen before vaccines have been rolled out to the whole population because of the impact on younger people not having access to the vaccine at the moment. But who knows? And as long as suitable protections are in place to ensure the security of data, vaccination passports are unlikely to breach data protection law. As I said at the outset, different questions apply for international travel because UK law can't affect what other countries have as their entry port requirements. Thank you so much for watching this video. You might also like this one on whether the government can force you to have the coronavirus vaccine, or this one on whether your employer can dismiss you for not having it. If I update this video because there's an update to the COVID passport situation, this is the place the video is going to appear. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Barrister Daniel Barnett. Bye bye.